Hello, I'm Tim Gray, and in this video, you're going to learn some of the key benefits of using raw capture for landscape photography. Of course, first, that brings up the subject of what exactly is a raw capture. Well, raw capture would generally be compared to JPEG capture, and as you may already be familiar, JPEG is a standard image file format. A raw capture, by contrast, isn't actually an image per se, but rather the raw capture contains the actual information gathered by the image sensor when you captured a photograph. What that translates to is better potential image quality, better detail, a variety of benefits that relate to image quality for your photos, and an ability to interpret those images based on your artistic preferences. One of the key features of a raw capture is that, at least in concept, there's no in-camera processing. With a JPEG capture, the saturation, contrast, sharpness, and other attributes of the image might be enhanced in the camera. That can make the image look better on the back of your camera, but it doesn't give you the flexibility that a raw capture provides. With this image, for example, if I turn on the before and after view here in Luminar, you can see that the before is exactly the same as the after. There has been no processing applied to this image yet, because I've just opened it in Luminar and haven't gotten started with my workflow. The key point is that the camera didn't overly process the image. In fact, you can see that I had some dust spots on my sensor, and the camera left those there for me, but it also left me with a tremendous amount of information that I can work with as I'm interpreting this image. There are some exceptions, certain special features that cameras will apply. For example, long exposure noise reduction would alter the actual raw capture. But as a very general rule, you can think of a raw capture as only being affected by the lens aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO setting for your capture. As a landscape photographer, of course, one of the key advantages of raw capture is exposure latitude. To be sure, I try to ensure that I get a perfect exposure for every image, but sometimes the scene might make that a little bit challenging, the lighting conditions might be tricky, I might not have very much time to evaluate the setup and get my shot, but raw capture gives me a little bit of wiggle room as it relates to the exposure. This scene, for example, was relatively contrasty. The exposure might have been fooled a little bit by the flowers in the foreground, potentially causing the clouds to get blown out. There would be a great deal of concern about losing detail in the highlights versus the shadows. And in fact, if you take a look at the histogram up at the top right of the Luminar window here, you can see that I really do have a pretty significant range of tonal values in the scene. And you would expect that to be the case with a scene like this where we have relatively high contrast. And yet, thanks to raw capture, there actually wasn't much of a challenge to make sure that I got this full range. I have some wiggle room thanks to the additional exposure latitude, and in fact, with a raw capture you can see the original image looks maybe even a little bit flat, not the contrasty scene that was there before my eyes and that I've interpreted with these adjustments in Luminar. Now, I'm not suggesting that you get lazy about setting your exposure optimally for each image, but one of the advantages of a raw capture is we have that additional flexibility. When we're interpreting the photo, we will actually preserve more detail, more information, especially at the extreme ends of the tonal range, with a raw capture as compared to a JPEG capture. Somewhat related to the notion of exposure latitude is the concept of dynamic range. And put simply, dynamic range is the range of tonal values you're able to capture between the darkest darks and the brightest brights. With a raw capture, you're getting considerably more dynamic range than would be possible with a JPEG image. That in part relates to bit depth in the camera. A JPEG image is limited to 8 bits per channel, or around about 16.7 million possible color values, whereas a raw capture is typically going to be around about 14 bits per channel, and in some cases even 16 bits per channel, which would give us over 281 trillion possible color values. What that translates into is more detail in your images. If we take a look at the before and after view, for example, you can see that while I've interpreted this image with considerable contrast, the original raw capture actually didn't look all that contrasty. and that's because the raw capture is able to retain considerable dynamic range for the scene. That gives me wonderful flexibility in post-processing to interpret the image exactly as I'd like. Going beyond issues of overall tonality, exposure latitude, and dynamic range, of course, we have to think about color as well, and that is another advantage of raw capture. With the JPEG capture, the color rendition at the time of capture is essentially baked into the image. You can certainly apply adjustments, but there's a risk that image quality will suffer to some extent. With a raw capture, the color interpretation of the photo, the temperature and tint, for example, is simply a metadata update. It does not actually affect the original raw capture, and that gives us great flexibility in terms of interpreting the color in the image. And so, for example, I could fine-tune the color temperature and the tint, the saturation and vibrance, for example, in order to improve the overall color. In this case, for example, there was some wonderful golden light illuminating the Alps in France, but the original capture didn't quite interpret that color all that accurately compared to what I was seeing in front of me. But thanks to raw capture, I'm able to interpret the color information in that original capture and produce a result that better matches my experience from that day. So far, I've been talking primarily about some of the technicalities related to your initial capture, to the overall exposure, for example. And to be sure, if you're using JPEG capture and you get the color and overall exposure absolutely perfect in the camera, then you're not going to have any significant challenges presenting that image. But there's still one factor that causes me to always choose raw capture over JPEG capture for landscape and other photography, and that relates to JPEG compression artifacts. Now, I want to stress right from the start here that I have exaggerated the effect so that you can better see it using a very low quality setting for this JPEG capture. If I zoom in, though, you'll be able to see JPEG artifacts. Because of the way JPEG images are compressed, the image is divided up into blocks generally of 16 by 16 pixels, and that can create a pattern in the image that is visible. Again, this is exaggerated so that you can get a better sense of what JPEG compression artifacts are, but even at a high quality setting, there is some possibility that you'll see some artifacts. You'll see some of the grid pattern in the background of the image, for example. Ultimately, raw capture is all about optimal image quality and maximum creative flexibility as a photographer. And to me, those are reasons enough to choose raw capture over JPEG for all of my landscape photography.